Over the last year, Book of Hours has been there for you during the most challenging times of our lives. As an artist collaboration, we've given shape and depth to some of the most complicated topics of our time, making them easily accessible for those who seek to understand. We've given voice and space to the stories that often go ignored. Please take a moment to consider being a patron, make a donation, or join Rockfin. Thank you. Hello, welcome to
Hi.
Pullquote.
How is everybody this morning?
Yeah, we got a little delay, but no big deal. We have a guest today that we're really excited about presenting. We have Eva Bartlett, journalist. Eva is an award-winning independent journalist, writer, and rights activist with extensive experience in Syria and the Gaza Strip, where she lived for three years out of 5. She documented the 2008, 2009, and 2012 Israeli war crimes and attacks on Gaza while riding in ambulances and reporting from hospitals. Since 2014, she visited Syria 14 times. During those visits, she talked to civilians, medical staff, and officials about what was happening on the ground and reported under the terrorist shelling and attacks in villages by al-Qaeda and other terrorist factions. The information from interviews and testimonies of people in Douma provided evidence that countered the narrative claiming that the Syrian government used chemical weapons against its own people. We first discovered her work when she, along with Vanessa Beeley, revealed the White Helmets as a fraudulent organization that were not the heroes that Netflix would have you believe. She currently lives in southern Russia. And welcome to Pullquote, Eva Bartlett. Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you both for having me. Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming onto our platform.
I
We're
know.
so honored to have you with us.
Yeah, I know I said journalist, but
My
I
pleasure.
know that you don't necessarily do you call yourself a journalist or just a writer, or what's the title you like to use?
I don't really care about labels. Journalist. I started in this as an activist. I would say I'm more of a journalist nowadays than an activist. But basically, I just follow my principles and I write about and speak about things that I believe in, and they are predominantly things anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist issues.
Yeah. Well, that's I think what attracted us to your work.
Yes.
The integrity there is foremost, I think.
Yeah, really.
Thank you.
Before we start talking about your latest article on your blog, I noticed that you're living in Russia now, living just outside of Moscow. Do you enjoy it?
I love it here. I moved here in January. Actually, an aside, I left Canada in February last year to go participate in a panel about freedom of speech targeting journalist Julian Assange. And I spoke about the targeting of journalists by Ukraine and targeting of Syrian journalists by terrorist forces and the utter silence that, these deaths have been met with by journalist protection groups. But as a consequence, I was outside of Canada before any of this COVID nonsense began. And so I haven't been back to Canada since. I ended up spending half of last year in Syria. And then I was in Serbia. And over the past few years, every time I've returned to Canada, I've thought, I don't really belong here any longer. I want to move somewhere eastward.
Mm-hmm.
Visited a couple of years ago. I really liked it. And I decided, okay, this is a contender for me. And then I decided to push for it and I moved here. I'm very happy here. You can see that I'm living in not in an apartment. I'm living in a wooden home with a gorgeous wood stove.
That way. Yeah.
Wow. That's lovely.
And 2 puppies you may see run through the room at some point. Hopefully not too noisy.
Yeah, that's good. We always
and
like
it's a beautiful area. I have a forest within a 10-minute walk away. It's a massive forest. It's just very, very good for the soul. I'm very happy here.
That's good.
Wow. Well, we're happy for you as well. That's wonderful.
Well, I noticed, we'll get into your blog in a second, but I noticed that one of the subjects on your blog that we weren't actually going to talk about, but I want to touch on quickly because you mentioned it, about the censorship going on by the Canadian government against journalists. What's going on? Are you feeling that, or can you talk to us about that for real quick?
Well, so since I wrote the article about Bill C-10, as I understand it, wasn't actually passed in Senate, but it was a bill that was passed in the House of Commons. That seemed all like, oh, let's just make content makers all equal, and let's make like YouTube and TikTok and whatever, major platforms have to, give a fair amount of Canadian content or some nonsense like that. On the surface, it seemed like it was just about being equal and all this. But I interviewed another Canadian journalist, Dan Dix, who's been following this with closer interest. And he was pointing out, like, actually, no, that's the surface explanation. But this is very dangerous for individuals like himself, myself, James Corbett, any Canadian journalist that is writing things, is publishing things on their websites, on YouTube that that go against Canadian policies, would have been at risk for being heavily censored. My understanding, I haven't followed up on this, working on a few things, but my understanding is that it didn't pass Senate. But on the other hand, this isn't the first time they've tried to introduce bills like this. So it's probably only a matter of time, especially given the current climate we all live in with the extreme censorship. It's probably only a matter of time before this type of bill is reintroduced.
Yeah.
This is my dog, Busia.
Buska?
Busia.
Oh, Busia.
Great. Very cute. Yeah.
Very cute. Obviously very very spoiled, very happy.
Did you know you're on camera?
I'm not spoiled, just well loved.
That's true.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm looking for.
Let's move on to the article that you wrote. Where the media is finally covering.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
this has actually been trending. One of our former friends in San Francisco, who is a host of a radio show, covered this story.
Guy Crittenden,
who's also from Canada, covered this story. He was on our show last time. So this is a popular. Sorry, can you give?
Yeah.
Can you speak to it a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I don't need to talk about it. You should.
Yeah. Well, so. The issue of what they call residential schools, or the Catholic school system that operated for nearly 100 years in Canada, when Canada was being founded with the genocide of the Indigenous people that lived here before the European colonists came here, Canada. This is an issue that Indigenous people have been speaking about for decades and have been trying to get the government to investigate for quite a while. So it surprised me when I saw suddenly, so what happened was in the past couple of months, there have been graves of children that were killed, children that were held in these schools that were presumably murdered in some fashion. These graves were recently unearthed in the past month or two. And so this has been making headlines that there was, I don't want to misquote the number. I feel like it's 900 or so. It might be, I'm sorry if I'm getting the number wrong, graves recently unearthed. So it's been, what I noticed was that whenever a story is going around global media, my initial response is not to think it's not true, but why are they giving importance to this story now? And that was the kind of the thrust of my article, was that, well, it's in my opinion, this did happen, and there's far more graves that will be unearthed eventually, and many just horrendous atrocities of how these children were treated and tortured and sexually abused, and abused in many ways we can't even fathom. This has come out, but it's been suppressed by the Canadian government and by the church. Yeah. So I guess my question was, like, why is this coming out now? Why is it being highlighted by global media now? And I think the obvious conclusion we could draw is that it's not a distraction. I don't mean to diminish from the importance of it, but I mean the fact that it's being given so much importance by the same media, as I wrote in my article, that sold us the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the chemical weapons hoax in Syria. If this same media, which we know does not have the best interest of the people or the public at heart, is pushing the story, that was my question.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that there was a lawsuit I guess it was regarding the same location, or found a mass grave somewhere. I don't know if it was the same one, but it was like from the 90s, and it kind of went nowhere. So it's not
Yeah,
like,
I'm
this
just
is
going to
anything
look at
new.
a document. Excuse me, but
Yeah,
a
yeah.
professor of Native Studies emailed me after he saw the article. So he was familiar with my work in Palestine and Syria and my writing. So he emailed me and introduced himself. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Six Nations tribe that he's from, because I won't be able to. But anyway, he introduced himself as a member of this tribe, and that he's now a professor at a university in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And then he went on. It's an extensive email, but he's going on to say how he did a very extensive study about just one district. I forget the name, whose community suffered in these quote residential schools, and he published the study, and eventually he was asked by some Canadian body to do another study, and more in-depth study. But basically what he said was he did a very in-depth study, and it was all suppressed, and he never heard from this body that reached out to him again. And he's basically saying he's reached out to Canadian media, nobody's interested. This was over the years. This isn't recently.
Yeah.
And so I've only just gotten this email, and I was looking at it this morning, so I haven't had time to fully digest it. But I definitely want to speak with this man, because he has a lot of knowledge about the crimes that were committed against Indigenous people, and about the fact that they've been hugely suppressed by the Canadian government.
Yeah. Well, some are pointing to the idea of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples being sort of a means of, or like, this is sort of like the first salvo in introducing that type of those types of rules into Canada as a means of, whatever it is. Some have been saying that it would be a means of, breaking up the country. There was similar to what's going on in New Zealand. Okay, so some people have been saying these kinds of things. As we know, anything that's sort of UN related, like the Sustainable Development Goals, are always framed in progressive language, and they sound great. They sound like, yeah, I'd like that, and yeah, who wouldn't want to give people sovereignty and autonomy that had their rights taken away from them. But these things always come around, and they're always like, they come in the form of like sort of a political jujitsu move.
Right. They're being used to actually undermine the very thing that they claim that they're helping. So,
Yeah.
and so when you say, well, this is interesting that this story has broken now and it's being covered all over the place. And I'm thinking,
Right.
okay, like you, why?
Why now?
And chances are the people, like I just said, the people that are, supposed to benefit from this unearthing are probably not going to benefit from it in the long run.
Absolutely.
So,
And also in the article, I noted the churches that had been vandalized, and
right. Yeah, I
the
wanted to
arson
bring that up.
laws.
Yeah. I'm sorry, you broke up.
Against some, you could.
Oh no.
Against Indigenous, but on the other hand, what does vandalizing and torching churches do? How does that bring any sense of justice? And it very much reminds me of the Black Lives Matter movement, to be honest.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that, but it just, you have Indigenous people saying, "Hey, this isn't the justice we're requesting. We don't want to burn down buildings. We want actual justice. We don't want an apology from the Prime Minister, a hollow, empty rhetoric talking about healing. We want actual justice." So, the attack on churches ties in with the media coverage, and it's, I don't know. We were chatting yesterday about orchestrated campaigns, so I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
You want to go for that? I can speak to that a bit. So
yeah,
and then you can talk too. So yes, we were talking about that, and how it is reminiscent of BLM and the whole statue removal. We covered this in a couple of our videos. I think in the communitarianism. Yeah, communitarianism. We're getting an echo for some reason. Is that you? Okay.
No, yeah, I don't think so. That's okay.
And so the churches, like you mentioned, I think you cut out a little bit there. So I'll just say, this is in your article, that The churches, some of the churches are no longer, or they're not necessarily churches, they're community centers for indigenous people. That, you know, they're using them as community centers, and yet they're getting torched. I have a feeling that these are outside forces, maybe, you know, agents provocateurs that are coming in to do these things, just as, you know, those statues were being removed and torn down. We had some footage of some statues being torn down in San Francisco in one of our videos, and you know, they were just silly. You know, they were old statues that the city considered junk anyway in some cases. But they were, you know, like the guy that wrote the Star Spangled Banner, Francis Scott Key's statue. And then Junipero Serra, the Junipero Serra statue was taken down. You know, and so these were just like, you know, symbols. And the one statue that was removed in England, he was a slave trader. You know, it was pulled down, thrown into the river by the activists, the you know, the protesters, and it was fished out of the river, taken back to the place that it was, you know, from, and then they put it into restoration. So they basically, it was
theater.
It was theater.
Yeah. They had taken the statue, thrown it into the river, and that's what you saw on camera. And we talked about a little bit yesterday too about how in some of these protests, the camera will focus on something, and which is totally different from what's really going on, right? They'll frame it and skew the image a certain way. So that's exactly what happened. You had these protesters rolling the statue into the river, and then moments later it was fished out of the river, cleaned off, and put into restoration. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of it was an empty gesture. So I think that in reference to your article about the graves that were discovered, and the protest movement that seems to have taken over everything, we're looking at a manufacturing of a dissent, a manufacturing of a cause, and the actual cause itself doesn't need to be manufactured. It doesn't need to be co-opted. Mm-hmm. It's already
it already exists, and yet it will be. So they will use the manufactured dissent in order to cover up and move away from, deflect from the actual problem that exists.
Right. So
exactly.
Sometimes in the protest movement, which is kind of what we talked about yesterday, you will see areas of the United States that have never, ever come out to protest for anything at all. All of a sudden, they have these, you know, perfectly designed signs, and there's, you know, a huge social media presence. And you're thinking, wow, you never did anything up until now. Why all of a sudden?
Yeah.
You know, so that's also a good indication that it's been manufactured and it's corporate backed and corporate sponsored, and that it's probably going to hurt the very cause that it claims to help in the first place. So, you know, that's my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're looking forward to more coverage on that subject. For sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, this gentleman that emailed me, I think he's going to be a wealth of information that I really would like. And the poor man, he, as I said, he approached Canadian media he was ignored. He was ignored by the people, I forget the acronym of the body that contacted him to do an in-depth study on this. And he finally was able to speak in Toronto, but had an audience of 600 people, which is, you know, good for a speech, but still he's got all this information and has been shunned, you know, for obvious reasons. So I really would like to speak with him and see, you know, at least try to share his voice and his information further.
Yeah,
good,
for sure.
Yeah, good. Absolutely. Yeah, we would love to see that.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, we were talking yesterday, and this kind of ties in with what we were talking about, the protests that we saw about a month ago regarding the Palestinians. And, you know, like Julie said, you know, suddenly there were signs and there were protests. Like, large amounts, like vast amounts of people showing up in these cities where, Palestinian rights protests had never existed before, and they had tons of Palestinian flags that somehow came out of nowhere. How many Palestinian flags have you ever seen?
In Arkansas,
yeah, or whatever. But like, I mentioned to somebody else, it's like San Francisco always had, Palestinian rights protests, but there was always a handful of people, maybe 100 at the most, and they would be downtown at the cable car turnaround, and there were maybe a couple flags, and 100 people, and they were mostly Palestinian folks that had emigrated, and so the diaspora, right? But now we saw around the world, we saw these huge Palestinian protests, and you mentioned to us yesterday when we were talking that those strikes by Israel in Gaza were nothing compared to like past strikes.
Right. So we would love it if you could speak to our audience about some of your past experiences covering this. Like, yeah.
Sure. Well, I went to Gaza by boat from Cyprus in November 2008. The reason I went by boat was that in the previous year, I had been in the rest of occupied Palestine. I'd been in the West Bank for 8 months doing activism with the ISM, the International Solidarity Movement, and eventually was arrested 3 times. And last time I was held 4 days, and I was banned I was deported by the Israelis from occupied Palestine, and I was banned from returning for 10 years, but it's most certainly a lifetime ban. But I was able to enter Gaza by boat from Cyprus, as I said, with the Free Gaza movement. And I ended up staying on for a year and a half. Eventually, in mid 2010, I left, and then over the course of the next few years, I was able to re-enter via Egypt, and I was going back and forth between Gaza and Canada. But cumulatively, I did spend 3 years there, and during that time, 3 years and 2 wars, I was there right before the December 2008, January 2009, I think it was 22 days now, war on Gaza began. And so during that war, I was riding in Palestinian Red Crescent ambulances to document the war crimes, and also as a human shield, frankly, because it was known that the Israelis do not respect international law, do target to kill Palestinian medics. So the handful of activists that were in Gaza, we decided to ride in the ambulances as human shields. And also in doing so, I was in northern Gaza, which was extremely hard hit. I was seeing dead bodies. Obviously, I was seeing injured Palestinians, elderly Palestinians that had been held at gunpoint for days, denied food, water, medicine, just psychologically tortured, shot. I met a woman that shot at point blank range in the stomach. And over the course of that massacre, I met in the main hospital, Shifa Hospital, I met a family, the Abu Halima family, who had survived Israel's use of white
Oops.
This bombing, which Israel has the army or the state of Israel faced any sort of repercussions for their point blank assassination, or they just ran, full on bombing of civilian homes. And you're probably aware, and I think people that are following events in Gaza in recent years would be aware of Israel's double strike technique, wherein they send a drone strike to a home or apartment building. And that's their benevolent way of saying, you have a few minutes to get the hell out of here before we bomb with an F-16. So if you're lucky enough to be able to get out of whatever the building is, whether it's a multi-story apartment building or a home, you might survive, but everything in your life is gone. This is Israel explains this as actually being benevolent while we warned them. Yeah, you warned civilians that you're going to destroy their homes and livelihoods for no reason other than punishment. It's collective punishment. So that's the kind of thing I was seeing in 2008-9. I mean, Israel targeted a medic I worked with. One night I was with him. under 16s, the drones, the Apaches, and the next morning he was dead by a dart bomb fired directly at the ambulance he was standing next to. His body was riddled with these little dart fragments. He went into shock and died. The next day, the Israeli army attacked his funeral, killing members of his family and friends in the neighborhood, also with dart bombs. And an Israeli sniper shot at an ambulance that I was in an area of northeastern Gaza during ceasefire hours, when civilians were supposed to be able to walk for 3 or 4 hours. They were supposed to be able to walk to get food, water, clothes, whatever, flee their areas. During ceasefire hours, uniformed medics, the Israeli snipers targeted uniformed medics just doing their duty, and they were picking up corpse, and they came under sniper fire, which led right to the ambulance that I was in. And they had to drop the corpse and run for their lives. And one of the medics was injured. There are countless stories of the Israeli army targeting medics. And what I didn't realize at the time, but which is very clear, is in doing so, they therefore prevent the medics from giving medical care to the people who desperately need it. So this was a theme throughout, all the wars that Israel has waged on Gaza. They do target medics. They target shelters housing internally displaced. In January 2009, they targeted the Fakura school, which was a UN school for which the Israelis had the coordinates, and they knew it was being used for internally displaced Palestinians. And nonetheless, they targeted, killing, I believe it was 40 or 50 Palestinians in that school. And their war crimes just from that massacre alone are endless. As I mentioned, point blank assassinating children. I took many testimonies of parents who said the Israeli army came to their, one family said the Israeli soldiers came to their door and they were snacking on chips and chocolate, and they point blank shot their children. Another family told me of their infant baby girl that was shot by an Israeli sniper, and she didn't die. The mother was nursing this infant as she slowly bled to death. And there are just so many horrific stories like this from the various massacres Israel has waged in Gaza. And again, no one has been held accountable. And it's not just me. This is well documented by many people. And then the other thing I should stress, I was also in Gaza in the 2012 massacre. This time I was in central Gaza reporting from a hospital there. And one of the most horrific things I saw there, when you're doing this kind of thing, actually, it's not that you become numb, but out of necessity, you have to learn to, I'm sure you can understand this with your understanding of psychology, you have to learn to compartmentalize what you're seeing. And the first time in 2009, I saw a dead body. The medic that I was working with that was later killed told me, Eva, you cannot cry. If you're going to be with us, you can't cry. So I learned to compartmentalize it. But in 2012, in November 2012, just 2 hours, I think it was, before the ceasefire was known that it was going to be implemented, a 14-year-old youth from Eastern Gaza, his body was brought in. And I'm sorry for the graphic description, but it was like spaghetti. He had been drone struck with a precision Israeli drone strike as he walked from his home to a store 100 meters down the road to get food for his siblings who had been hungry for the last 5-6 days. And the Israeli army could see the pattern of his shirt, and they drone struck him. And this is the level of their sadism. And the thing I just want to point out is that I'm talking about two massacres, but these kind of things happen almost every day. And this is another element. The Palestinians there, although they've become used to it because they've grown up with it, or they've lived under it for so many years, every day they're subject to psychological torture and terror. The Israeli F-16s, the drones. If you've never heard the sound of a drone, it's a horrifying sound, and it's a tone that it's like a giant mosquito in the sky. And if you have more than one, then you have these maddening sounds conflicting and clashing, and you know what they're capable of. And then you have the F-16 flyovers. Then they periodically will do a sonic boom or an actual bomb, and these things are never reported in the media. So I could go on and on. I'm sure you want to hear more about, like, it's not just the bombing, it's every aspect of their life that is controlled by Israel. And just today I was chatting with someone, and they were saying, well, Israel says Gaza isn't under siege because of the border with Egypt. No, Egypt is complicit in the blockade of Gaza, which has been enforced since, I believe, 2007, if I remember correctly. So 2006, 2007, that's 14 years plus of Palestinians in Gaza not being able to move. Okay, they're not able to leave their borders, including for medical care, for which they have, doctor's notes, and they need to go outside of Gaza because Israel's destroyed the infrastructure so much and denied them from importing necessary medical equipment and medicines that there are certain cases they need to get treatment outside of Gaza, and Israel doesn't allow them to go out, nor does Egypt. Most cases, rarely they'll allow some out. Israel, as I mentioned, severely limits the imports of goods into Gaza. And I think for the average person, it's hard to comprehend, well, what does that mean? It means they limit, at one point, they were only allowing around 40 items into the Gaza Strip. This means like items that we take for granted, diapers, milk, toys, canned goods, just anything you can think of, cooking gas, were being prohibited entry into the Gaza Strip. When they banned cooking gas, Palestinians started cooking over kerosene, which, if you ever used a kerosene lamp, it's a terribly noxious, toxic smell. And they're cooking over this because they have no other means. And Israel knows that. Amira Haas, an Israeli journalist that I believe she still writes for Haaretz, she wrote this, a very compelling article, I forget the year, I want to say 2008 or 2010, where she outlined precisely this, that the Israeli authorities were specifically denying entry into Gaza of most vital things they needed. And of course, the explanation will always be, well, these are dual use items. The terrorists in Gaza could use them to harm Israelis. There are 2 million people in Gaza. And now, when I last wrote a really long article about it some years ago, it was like over 80% of the population was dependent on food aid for their survival. And now that number has to be higher because the siege has continued. The farmers, when they try to work on their land, they come under Israeli gunfire, not even tear gas, but actual machine gun fire, sniper, just for the crime of being on their land. And what the Israelis will say is, well, we have a buffer zone on the Gaza side because terrorists in Gaza, so they can't go 300 meters up to the border. But I've been with these farmers, whether they're young men working as paid laborers and making a pittance, or their entire families from grandparents to children working on the land. And we've been 500, 600, 700 meters from the fence and still come under Israeli gunfire. So these are policies that are meant to push the people off their land and keep them from working that land. And then on top of that, every week or two, the Israeli bulldozers and tanks enter into Gaza and just raze the land. It's already long been destroyed. Yesterday, I was saying that region, the border region of Gaza, was formerly the agricultural breadbasket of Gaza. It was plentiful. It had all sorts of olive fruit and nut trees, and now it's barren. At most, people grow crops like wheat or barley that don't need a lot of maintenance, that they can just hopefully put the seeds and come back later and expose themselves to less potential being shot at and killed by the Israelis or maimed. But it used to be a very plentiful and agriculturally rich area. So now they've taken that from them. And then I remember back when I was living in Gaza, I went and I documented the systematic destruction of wells and cisterns in Gaza. And I think you can appreciate that area being a very hot region, and that doesn't get rain all year round, you would need the ability to collect water. Israel's cut off the flow of water from the rest of occupied Palestine into Gaza. And on top of that, destroyed their ability to contain whatever water, they could have been able to contain. So they've really assaulted their every means of existence, including, just as they target farmers, they target fishers in the water. And the fish should be able to fish 20 miles off the coast, but they come under Israeli gunfire a mile or two off the coast. And if you can imagine, like, there's this thing called a hasaka. It's essentially just bigger than a surfboard. The skinny Palestinian fishers wearing just shorts, so clearly unarmed, clearly no threat whatsoever to this massive Israeli gunboat. They'll paddle out and drop their nets, and later they'll pull the net in. And they come under fire. And there's no other reason other than systematic top-down abuse that is meant to kill the Palestinians, kill their spirit, make them want to leave Gaza.
Well, this is yeah, and I read this in your article here, on your blog, the observations from occupied Palestine and Gaza, and all the things that you were talking about were mentioned in there, and the idea of oh man, where do I start? This is just outright genocide.
Yeah.
When you look at it, it was just and it's systematic,
Yes.
and it feels like Nazi Germany is what it feels like, and um, or any other genocide that we've heard about. But this seems even more targeted, more systematic. This is almost like what was done to the indigenous people in the United States, killing not only food sources but also culture and ways of life. Back to like what we were talking about at the beginning of the program. But you mentioned in your article about the fishermen, how the attacks would also not only just like scare them off, but it would destroy their equipment, destroy their boats,
Yeah.
make their boats, unusable, to the point of like destroying the boat itself, but also like communications equipment.
Mhm.
And to your point about like the F-16 flyovers, I mean, when we were in San Francisco, we would be inundated with the Blue Angels shows, and also the Canadian Air Force flyers would come over as well. And those were loud, and they probably were F-16 or something similar. And they frightened everything that was living. So
Yeah.
I can only imagine what what they're doing to the Gaza Strip, in the form of harassment of flyovers like that. It's deliberate, and they do things deliberately to make the sound even more intensified.
And
Um,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Julie.
oh, I was just thinking about the children.
Yeah.
Are they? I don't know much. Is it true that they have to go into some kind of quarantine or some kind of prison if they are walking to school and they're walking out of a certain area and they happen to be? Is that true? Like I seem to recall years ago seeing a video of a kid walking to school and being taken, kidnapped. So I mean that's kidnapping, right?
Yeah, well, to be clear, just in case people you would be referring to the West Bank, Jerusalem,
Right.
the rest of occupied Palestine. In Gaza, they no longer have, well, except when they invade, but they don't have a physical presence within Gaza. They control every aspect. It's still an occupation, but they're not physically there except when they invade. But yeah, they do that. Now, I don't know the current statistics, but again, some years ago, I wrote an article about, I think I called it abduct, imprison, repeat, or something like that, about the fact that this is something else that, of course, people who advocate for Palestinians will talk about, but the average person would have no idea that you can be sitting in your home and they'll raid your home and abduct you or abduct your children, including like 3-4-year-old kids. Like it's unbelievable. But there have been, I don't want to say like one or two instances. I have to imagine it's many more instances when toddlers have been abducted. What the Israelis will do when it's older kids, they'll say, well, they were throwing stones. You know what? Even if they were throwing stones, so what?
Right.
You're an
Right.
occupier. If they were throwing stones, power to them, but you can't abduct them and put them in prison and torture them. But they do.
Yeah, it goes along the
And
lines of, yeah. Go ahead.
there's a number of Israeli rights groups that have documented this. The first one that comes to mind is Bet Salem. They've extensively documented the abduction of Palestinians, including children. I think Defense for Children International, I think that was their name, also has written about this. So the information is out there. It's just not in the media.
Mm-hmm. Well, we were talking yesterday again. The stones versus throwing stones versus machine guns and tanks. From the Intifada. Intifada. I'm sorry, I get that word wrong all the time, and I've only lived with it since the '80s, right? But and like hearing about that, like back the first one, right? And the children throwing stones, and yet you've got or rocks, and you've got what's the difference at this point? Tanks and automatic weapons being waged against them. And it's like Northern Ireland on steroids. But now it feels like it's even more so. It's just a crushing. Like for every little infraction that the Israelis seem to feel they're against them, there's like 100 times the force that goes back against the Palestinian people, no matter where they live, whether it's the Strip or the West Bank or Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean, we were chatting earlier about the demolitions that Israel's enforcing or whatever doing in Jerusalem, and the just like the sadistic mindset of like you have two choices because you don't have a building permit because we didn't issue a building permit because we never will because we're your occupiers and we have a different legal system, so your house is thereby not legal because you don't have a permit. It's circular logic, but you have two options: either you demolish your house yourself or we're going to come do it and then you're going to have to pay the bill. I mean, how sick is that? And these are Palestinians that were living there for certainly generations before Israel even existed, But just because they don't have this technicality of a building permit that they can never ever possibly get, Israel. And I was thinking about that too. I was thinking like, what an irony. They want these areas, they want these buildings demolished to make more room for their illegal colonists. And so the big irony is that Palestinians don't have a little piece of paper issued by their colonizers, their occupiers, and yet these illegal Jewish colonists can come and just take their land and their home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a one-sided system. One of the things that we were reading about was this area in East Jerusalem called Silwan. That's my pronunciation. I don't know what it is. And they want to tear out these Palestinian homes in this area in order to build this boggles my mind. It's like an amusement park that's like Bible themed. It's a Bible park, amusement park. Yeah,
it's stunning.
It's
no, I think
so.
Yeah, you're frozen a bit.
Yeah.
There's an example from another area of the occupied West Bank, south of the city of. The Palestinians, are you hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Is it breaking up?
There's touchy, touch and go.
I have a feeling we're being, messed with a bit, but
we could be, but we'll see.
Go on.
So there's this, I wonder if I can do the screen share thing. Do I have a map open? Okay, that's Gaza. Let me close. Actually, I'll keep that open.
Good, I'm glad.
Okay, no, I thought I had a map. Okay, it's not a big deal. Anyway, it's an area that's in the south of the bank, and Palestinians had lived there since like the 1800s in this particular area. It's very much a desert area, but they had stone homes, very beautiful stone homes, and they also had cave homes, very intricately carved cave homes, and they had been living there. But then in the, I want to say 80s and 90s, Israel basically evicted them under the premise that it was a closed military zone. This is the terminology they use when they want to kick Palestinians out, unless they just allow these illegal colonists to come in and beat the hell out of them and just take the home, violently. But otherwise, if they're trying to do it like legally, they call it a closed military zone. And so they essentially evicted all these Palestinians from the homes where they've been living for generations. They now live in ramshackle tin and fabric tents about 100 meters away from their historic homes. And the parallel, aside from kicking them out of their land, off their land and out of their homes, the parallel is that the Israeli authorities then went on to say, oh no, these were ancient Jewish, this is an archaeological, these were ancient Jewish homes. So the owners are like literally right there and wanting to go back to their homes. And on top of that, then they suffer, of course, predictable abuse from the Israeli army and from the colonists at a nearby colony who come and beat them, including elderly. They, we were talking as we chatted yesterday about trees. They've cut down or stolen their olives. They've poisoned their water and killed their sheep and goats. It's like they've done everything they can to exterminate these people. And this is what's happening throughout occupied Palestine. It's just, it happens in different ways, whether it's kicking them out of their homes and replacing them with this Bible theme park, or just allowing these savages, these European mostly, and American illegal colonists to come in and occupy their homes.
Right. Yeah. Well, you mentioned in your article about uh, I think you were with some farmers and some colonists showed up and started throwing rocks. So here again, coming back to the rock theme, right? They're throwing rocks at the farmers, and one of the people you were with was injured, not hurt badly, but the fact that they had to deal with this, people who are not from the area, who are moving in and trying to force people off their land who have been there for whatever generations.
Yeah.
Just the fact that they're trying to force people out of their own homes, their own land, and to keep them from feeding themselves or even having a some sort of means of making a living.
Yeah, this was during the olive harvest, and this happens every year during the olive harvest because, of course, if they prevent Palestinians from harvesting their olives, then you know what an important source in the diet the olives and the olive oil is.
Sure.
So if they can't harvest their olives, then that's a year's worth of their harvest that's
Right.
gone.
And
But the other
more cruel, right?
Absolutely. And then there's another component. So aside from the fact that they're routinely assaulted by these illegal colonists, also in many instances, they can't even reach their land because the army won't let them. It's their land. They have the paperwork, but the army will be like, no, you have to apply for permission to go onto your land. And of course, with the legal system being against Palestinians, they more often than not, they don't get permission. But I remember an instance when I was with farmers. I forget the name of the area now. It was farmland near the northern Palestinian city of Nablus, and they had they jumped through the hoops. They'd gotten the permission to be on their land for a very short period of time, for a day or two. And we're on the land, and they'd only just started walking, and then this horde of colonists comes down the hill, descends down the hill in their white garbs with dogs, big dogs, attack dogs, and guns slung over their shoulders, and basically menace the Palestinians off their land, and the army tells them to go. This is how it plays out. So they've played by this legal system that is skewed against them, and they still can't access their land.
It's relentless and dehumanizing. Can I bring up the one I forget the guy who
I'm sorry. Right. Yeah, let me share that for you. Go ahead.
So this is this is still on topic, and I don't mean to spring it on you, but I've been doing some research about the about discriminating against your, how do I say it? Discriminating against who you are for being less than. This is all part of a bigger, more global discussion. It's more than just trying to create like designer humans. But one thing that you had said before, which is that you are allowed to see the stories, for instance, about the graveyard, right, in Canada. You're allowed to see these stories. So there's this weird narrative that came out a few years ago that this person had said that Palestinians were less than human, and I'm wondering, like, do they really believe that? I mean, that is appalling and atrocious that someone would actually say it, and then that it would be allowed to be seen. This is a Mondo Ice link, but this kind of narrative gets floated around there on social media and out there, and you were there. Is that really how they feel?
Yeah. I don't remember the woman's name. She was in the news. I want to say it was probably in 2010 or 11. I believe it was after. It might have been after. I'm not sure, but anyway, I believe it was after the 2009 massacre. I don't remember her name. She's an attractive, dark-haired woman, and what I remember is her calling Palestinian children little snakes. That same dehumanizing. And she said other remarks equally vile. And after the 2009 massacre, there were T-shirts that came out that showed a pregnant Palestinian woman, and then like an Israeli sniper's scope, and it said 1 shot, 2 kills. But even aside from that, when I first went to the West Bank, I met up with this group called Combatants for Peace, and basically I went on my own, as I do everywhere. I went on my own to the West Bank, and I went in via Jordan. And before I joined the ISM, I wanted to be able to say, okay, look, I've tried to hear other opinions. So I went on my own to the West Bank. I met this group, Combatants for Peace, and I spent, I think, a couple of weeks with them, going to some of their meetings. And the premise there was that they were former Israeli soldiers and former Palestinians that are resistance in some way, although of course there's never any a balance to that, because they could have been considered like having resisted by throwing rocks or Molotov cocktails, or actually armed resistance, right? But anyway, the idea was that they would go to communities and they would talk about their change of heart. And so, they're trying. It's a nice idea, but when the racism and apartheid is so systematic, it's not enough. But anyway, it did expose me to this mentality you're talking about. So this one former soldier said his moment of awakening was, he said he was ready to kill 100,000 Arabs or something like that. That's another thing, is the Israelis won't call them Palestinians. They call them Arabs, or worse. Not that Arabs is bad. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean that, but they won't recognize that they're Palestinians.
Right.
And he said something like, I was ready to kill 100,000 Arabs. But then at one point, if I remember correctly, he had his gun, his sniper rifle, trained on a child who looked like the same age as his own daughter. And that was his moment of actual awakening, he said, where he realized, oh, it's a human like my daughter. So he was admitting that's how indoctrinated he was. Okay. So I'm not excusing anything. I'm just saying, like, this was a personal anecdote that I heard from him. He was ready to slaughter because he believed it was, self-defense and all this. And then he finally realized this is a human being. And I remember another time there's a village in the West Bank called Bilain, which I'm sure many have heard of, because it's a village that has mounted popular resistance against Israel's land theft and their apartheid wall since, I believe, 2005 or 6. They've been holding every Friday popular demonstrations that have been met with insane amounts of violence from the Israeli army, for everything from obviously the tear gas canisters, including high velocity ones that can be shot directly at people and kill them, as they've done, to the rubber bullets, which are really lead bearings that are covered with a thin sheath of rubber, which they actually cut into to ensure that the lead bearing or whatever it is will come out of the rubber and do more damage, to actual snipers' guns used against these civilians. I marched with them, I want to say 10 or 11 times. So I got a taste of everything, the tear gas, everything. Thankfully not the rubber bullets or worse. But I remember at one demonstration, there was a young soldier, and he was like, he was training his sniper's rifle or whatever on a child. And I said, what are you doing? You're going to kill this kid. And I was like trying to get in front of him. And he was so in the zone. He was like, I was like, now I think about it, was he on drugs or what? But probably not. He probably really believed he was justified in potentially slaughtering this kid who was at a popular demonstration.
Okay, so we're talking about some serious psychological indoctrination, which, so the term I was looking for was genetic discrimination. So it makes, racism or even classism, it pales in comparison. It's the extermination of those that you feel are genetically inferior to you. And so, of course, it's, eugenics. So I'm wondering if they're using these experiences that you yourself have witnessed firsthand, if they're using that as kind of the template or the test balloon for the rest of the world now. I'm just, thinking out loud here. One of our next pieces will be about this genetic discrimination, and it comes out of DARPA and Regina Dugan, who was, CEO of Facebook at one point, and
well, not CEO.
She was part of, not CEO of Facebook, but she was part of the Facebook program. Anyway, she talks a lot about this very thing that you are talking about in very real ways, where the person is in the zone, where you can't even reach them because the indoctrination is so deep. I'm just, I'm speechless. This is terrible.
Well, and a kind of a counterpart to that is, I remember talking with elderly Palestinian farmers in Gaza, and what we always hear in the Zionist media, oh, well, Arabs hate us. Oh, they raise their children to hate us. It's not true, actually. If the
Right.
children hate, it's because they've been put through hell and back, and they've seen their buddies be killed by the Israelis, or they've lost their homes, or any number of crimes. But I remember this older farmer in Eastern Gaza. He was saying, like, he was referring to, I think, after the unjust and illegal creation of Israel, he was referring to neighbors he had before the 67 occupation and of further occupation of Palestinian land. And he was like, we used to be neighbors, we used to share tea. He referring to his Jewish Israeli neighbors. And so for me, it was just like, wow, like, here's a person whose whole entire homeland has been occupied, and he's still looking back, and he was willing to share his food and his tea and break bread with them. It's just like, there's a movie, I'm sure you've heard of it. I saw it years ago when I was living in DC for a brief stint, and it was called Real Bad Arabs. And it was about, I forget who the director was, but it was about how pervasive the anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian stereotypes are in Hollywood. Everything from, obviously, like, I think one example was not Indiana Jones, Back to the Future, where randomly, like, this minivan of Palestinians wearing kufias and holding AK-47s shows up. And I don't remember the movie because I was so young when I saw it, but I think it had nothing to do with the plot line, as I recall from this documentary. And even like stereotypes of Arabs in Bugs Bunny, and, just like how pervasive and indoctrinating, because it's always a stereotype that doesn't show a very cultured and educated Arab person. No, it's always a very backward stereotype they're trying to portray.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, so speaking of that, then, it's weird then that we're seeing the lifting up of Muslims and Arabs in, and again in mainstream media. But I feel again that it's a way of identifying an identity rather than supporting a culture or a people, and in identifying that identity, dispersing any sort of real cultural meaning, or any taking away any of the prejudice that was there in the first place. What do you think about that? What's going on with the like in UN or EU or any of the talking points that you hear coming out of those organizations
with regard to Palestine?
Well, regard to Muslims and Arabic peoples.
To be honest, I don't spend a lot of time watching. Or the UN is, I want to say, an institution. It serves imperialism.
Mm-hmm. You're cutting out.
I'm just saying I don't spend a lot of time reading there, because there's a lot more for me, like, the fact that Syria is under sanctions and people can't afford to eat.
Right.
I'd rather spend my time, addressing
Thank
that.
you. Yes.
Yeah, and I that's, I guess, where I was going. Even the World Economic Forum, they want to focus on identity rather than on actual. Okay, so maybe that's where I'm going. They would rather focus on the idea of racism and identity, focused on a given, like on the Muslim population, as opposed to the actual human rights violations that are taking place in these countries.
Mm-hmm. Right. I see.
Yeah. You were telling us, I think it was Syria. You were telling us that inflation is so bad. Is it Syria, where the inflation is so bad that you can't afford to even just buy the things that you could afford to buy before? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So, Syria has been sanctioned by the West. Not even years, for decades, I want to say. But in June, I think it was June last year, the U.S. and allies passed, the U.S. and then its allies are adhering to it, passed the Caesar Act, which is the latest, most brutal round of sanctions against Syrians. And they knew very well, already after 10 years of war, Syria's economy is devastated. But they knew very well that by passing this new act, it was going to further decimate the economy, and it has done so. I'm not a financial expert, so I can't speak to how it works, but it is, I have read about it, and it is known that when you impose sanctions on a country, it will mess with the economy. And so Syria, prior to the war, the Syrian pound, $1 was around 50 Syrian pounds. I started going to Syria in 2014, and around at that time, I want to say $1 was somewhere between 400 and 500 Syrian pounds. Last year, when I went to Syria in March, I think $1 was, I might be wrong, I think it was around 700 pounds. Anyway, currently, $1 is over 3,000 Syrian pounds, but the Syrian salaries have not changed. So suddenly, many Syrians have told me prior to the war in Syria, they were living quite well. Their salaries were more than enough to eat well, to go on trips, to own a car, to live like normal people and have luxuries. Now they can't even afford to properly eat. Like when I was in Syria, I was actually back in Syria, when was it? At the end of May this year. And so here's a very minor, seemingly trite example, but it makes a variety. A bag of hummus used to be for pounds. And that's just a bag of hummus, but this is a simple staple protein that a family can eat that's less expensive than, say, meat. But when I was talking to friends there, one gave me the example. He's the average salary is between 50 and 60,000 pounds. He was saying, like, I went to the market to buy vegetables for the next few days, and I spent a quarter of my salary. And that's just vegetables. That's without buying meat. That's without paying for fuel or cooking gas. And then our good friend Vanessa, who's living, she recently posted saying, now a canister of cooking gas, I think she said it costs 70,000 pounds. 70,000 pounds, where the average salary is 50 to 60,000. So, and on top of which there's a gas shortage. So now families, how are they going to cook? Because you can't rely on electricity, because electricity is out for the majority, most of the day. It comes in waves, so they might get an hour or two, and then it's off for 3 or 4 hours. So it's just like in Gaza. And by the way, in Gaza, when I was there, the power was out for 20 or 22 hours every day. So, these are means of suffering we can't even comprehend. I mean, I do, because I lived there, but you have a refrigerator that doesn't function any longer. You can't keep anything. If you've managed to buy food, you can't keep it from turning bad in the summer heat. So these are a direct impact of the sanctions. The sanctions, the U.S. regime will say the sanctions are targeting Syrian officials, and they'll call it a Syrian regime officials, but they're targeting people. Like people are. It's hard to find basic medicines now, let alone if you have a specific cancer or a specific disease that needs a specific medication. If you can find them, they would be extremely expensive. And it's endless. It's, everything from fuel for the car. Again, referring back to Vanessa, I remember her talking about there being fuel lines for days, people waiting for days just to possibly get fuel if they could afford to buy it. So that affects cab drivers' ability to work. And many members of the Syrian army, by the way, their salary is also not a big salary. So a lot of these members of the army work another job in addition, just in order, like most Syrians work 2 or 3 jobs just in order to be able to exist. And even doing so, now they can't afford life, and this is all a product. And also the Western meddling in Lebanon too. I mean, I was just reading today on, I think, RT, that Lebanon is close to breaking point also, because their currency has also skyrocketed. I can't really speak in detail to Lebanon. I haven't been following it that closely, but they are directly related. And Vanessa was saying in an interview, I think it was recently, the U.S. Targeting of Iraqi positions and the Iraqi crossing into Syria affects both Syria and Lebanon, because there is trade still between Syria and Lebanon, and just this is all creating havoc in those countries. Specifically, again, the main reason is always not because Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal. He's not. it's because they want to control the region. The U.S. and its allies want to control the region. If they're not going to, just like if Palestinians won't bow to Israel, then Israel's going to inflict maximum punishment, to put it lightly, on them. And it's the same with these sanctions that have directly created this financial havoc in Syria.
We've pointed out that what is going on in the Middle East and like Palestine and Syria, um, and Lebanon, the things that are going on and being done to these people will eventually turn around and be done to those of us in the Western nations, in the post-industrial countries like the U.S.,
Yeah.
Canada, and the European countries. And I don't think people have any idea. And it's going to be a lot more subtle because I don't think that the powers that are doing these things necessarily want to destroy their own lands, but they do want to harass the citizens and make them leave. And like, this is nothing compared to what's going on in the Middle East. But I mean, last year and this year, we've been inundated with fireworks campaigns and like loud, very professional grade fireworks. And as Julie's pointed out, it's like they don't want to bomb people because that would destroy the property and the real estate. But they can certainly do a reasonable facsimile thereof and harass people through sound.
Right. The trauma. We live in a neighborhood that's pretty poor. It's a food desert and rubbled out streets. It looks a little bit like someone took a bomb to it at times. Blighted buildings. And so there's a lot of trauma here. There's a lot of people coming off of drug addiction. There's a lot of poverty. And so these massive fireworks campaigns, last year it went on for a couple of months. This year,
Wow.
yeah.
And
So
this happened all across the United States,
right, and this is by no means, we're not comparing our situation with
No, but still,
yeah.
Who's behind? I mean, is there anybody? Is there anybody officially saying we're doing these campaigns and this is because, or is it not clear?
There's nobody knows where they're coming from. Nobody in this neighborhood can afford this level of professional grade fireworks displays.
Wow.
We're talking just fireworks displays that you would normally see like at huge celebrations in neighborhoods of deep poverty. Like,
and I wanted to talk to our neighbors who were shooting a lot of these fireworks off. I didn't,
some of them, yeah.
But like, they had pretty high-end fireworks that they were shooting off basically all night. And it's like, I know that this isn't something that they bought themselves. They were these things were distributed, and I have a feeling that even if I asked them where they got them from, they'd say somebody just gave them to us, or whatever. I mean, I'm assuming this, right? But I can't imagine that they would know where these things come from. But these campaigns have been noted and documented or talked about all across the country. And we had a video recording of last year's 4th of July in Los Angeles, and this was taken from the hills of LA. And LA is a basin. It's a flat area surrounded by hills, and this panned across the whole section of Los Angeles, and it was this professional grade fireworks shooting off from all over. And the hills that this camera angle was from were higher than the fireworks, so it was just bizarre to see. And they weren't individual cities within LA County that were doing fireworks displays. These were everywhere. It was just a blanket of fireworks. It was crazy.
It almost feels like we're being primed and prepped for some serious trauma in the future. And that's why one of the many reasons I really wanted you to come on board and give such detailed explanations about what it means to, have somebody commit cultural genocide or these really aggressive campaigns of removing a population from its home. I wanted you to speak to that so that, I feel that Americans kind of need to broaden a little bit, maybe understand that this could very well be our future. And we're starting to see little signs of it here and there,
And another example, of course, is in eastern Ukraine, right? The Donbass.
Right. We were just going to get there. Yeah.
We wanted to
okay, I'm sorry to jump the gun.
No, that was a great transition.
Great transition. Thank you.
Well, I mean, because you were saying, like what you're saying about, people don't realize that this could come to you. And the people in the Donbass never saw this coming. I was there 2 years ago, and I went to the Donetsk. Oh, there's a bit of feedback, huh?
I think we're okay now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
okay.
Fire from Ukraine. Everything.
Yes. So I'm getting an echo.
Oh no.
Yeah, we had that earlier. It might have something to do with me sharing, but I don't know.
Is it better now?
Let me try speaking. No, I'm still getting. I'll just try to ignore myself.
Oh.
Okay. Mine went away. It might go away. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
A lot of audio issues today.
So in this article that you've shared, there's also a YouTube playlist that I put up, Donetsk People's Republic. I was there for, I forget now, just under 2 weeks, I think, around 2 weeks. And I went to a city called Gorlovka, which is north of Donetsk. And then I went to frontline villages that are literally less than a kilometer, sometimes 500 meters away from the Ukrainian forces that are shelling them on a daily and nightly basis. So ostensibly there's a ceasefire, but the Israeli, well, they're kind of the same, aren't they? The Ukrainian forces are using prohibited artillery on these people who, from what I saw, were predominantly elderly people who have nowhere to go. Even if they could flee, they have nowhere to go and no means to exist. So they're staying in their homes that are being ravaged nightly. And even if their homes aren't fully destroyed, I saw houses that are have chunks of holes in the walls, and the people don't know they didn't know how they were going to survive the winter because they have no means of patching it up. But this one older woman I met in a village called Mine 67, she lives alone. Her husband died some years ago, and when I met her, she really reminded me of my mother for some reason. Just something about her, her strong will. But I just felt heartbroken when I met her, because I thought, my God, I wouldn't want anyone to live like this. But now I feel like she's my mother, and here she is telling me she doesn't know how she's going to make it through the winter. And that's just to do with patching up her home and surviving the shelling and the heavy machine gun fire. In addition to the fact that she doesn't have an income, she probably has a pension. To access that pension, she would actually have to go into Ukraine. Right. So that's a whole story in itself that apparently takes quite a long time. And so, their lives are miserable. And she said there's these observers. I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's OSCE. Right. And they're supposed to be neutral observers that are there to ensure both sides keep the ceasefire. But they go away. This is what I was told by a local journalist. They go away around 6 p.m. and that's when the really heavy shelling starts. And there's nobody. The reason they do it then is that there's nobody there to document it and to say it's happening, even though the residents are saying it's happening. They're filing complaints. So this is back to what you're saying about it could happen to your own people. I mean, these people, when I spoke with them, they said, look, we never foresaw our own country warring against us. We didn't want what happened in Maidan to happen to us. We didn't want what happened in Odessa. We didn't want these neo-Nazis to come to us. And also, the people in this region are ethnically Russian, and they wanted to be able to speak their own language, right? And Ukraine is increasingly, if not fully eradicated, Russian-speaking from the areas they control. These people were aware of what could come to them. So they initially just wanted to be independent of that. And then as time progressed and Ukraine was warring against them, they wanted their own republics. And so, the media portrayal, of course, is atrocious. If they even report on it, they'll say, the Russian invasion of Donbass and that Ukraine is fighting Russian soldiers, which is absolutely bonkers. These are people, ironically, much as the white helmets are portrayed as former bakers and various civilian jobs, this is actually what these people are. They're just people who took up arms to defend themselves against these heavily armed Ukrainian neo-Nazi forces that are attacking them. Yeah. And just one other thing I wanted to mention, it's related, is Crimea, of course, because I know you're probably going to mention the British vessel that came towards Russian waters. I think it sailed near Sevastopol, Crimea,
Right.
and
Yeah.
their
Operation
pretext.
Sea Breeze, or yeah.
Yeah, and their pretext is that they don't recognize Crimea as being a part of Russia. But I did go there a couple of years ago, and I'm not saying like, okay, I said it, so it has to be true. But I'm just saying, in my experience, when I spoke with people there, again, they're ethnically Russian. They want to speak their language, and they said a lot of the people I met and spoke with, they said, well, it's not that Russia annexed us; it's that we returned to Russia. They specifically said returned, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I remember
So,
that. Yeah. Well, and again, it's coming back to what we were talking about, weaponizing identity, and in this case, using language as that pretext for using it as a weapon to and propaganda, and a means of selling the idea that these people are interlopers. And I've seen this before, where they're talking about, well, they've only been here since such and such a date, and this is our land, and blah blah blah. And it was very interesting to hear or to read in your article. And by the way, what publication was that in, that article that we were showing?
That was on Mint Press News.
Mint Press News. Okay, yeah. We'll put up links in our show notes later. But I was reading that, and I noticed that language was a big issue on both sides, and also the idea that these forces from Ukraine were using Western armaments and bombs and rifles. They were U.S. Sniper rifles, and the militia. And what is it? Donbass?
Yeah, Donbass is like the region, and it's the greater region. So you will find parts of the Donbass that are in Ukrainian-controlled territory, but then the two republics are the Donetsk People's Republic and the I think it's Lugansk People's Republic.
Okay, yeah. So the militia were saying, we'll come across this after a skirmish, and these things are abandoned, and we know that these are weapons that are from the West. They're from the the EU and Poland, and so Poland is EU country. So it's amazing that and they were saying, it's like, why is Europe and why is the US and why is the West supporting neo-Nazis? I mean, these people actually are wearing swastikas.
Yeah, and they asked me, like, what do people back home think about the fact that the West is supporting Nazis? And I said, well, most people don't know, because of our media.
They don't.
No, and when there is coverage, it's very slanted. I mean, we were talking about NPR earlier when we were talking about Palestine, and this article that we were talking about with you before we went on the air, it was just just a fluff piece, and just address the very surface level of what was actually going on. And when I'd heard in the past, I haven't listened to NPR in a long time because I couldn't deal with it anymore. I couldn't. It was too hard picking out the real news out of the propaganda, and anytime you'd hear anything about that region, it would always be in the terms of like you said, the Russian fighters and the Russian army coming in, and everything to do with Putin invading, and nothing to do, and maybe surface level coverage of like maybe there were some Nazi, sympathizers, and they, and that was it, And I also realized that this goes back to, the Orange Revolution back in, what was that, 2004, 2005, somewhere around there. I don't remember exactly.
Can you speak to the Orange Revolution? Did you want her to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I can't. I have to admit, I'm rather new to the issue of Donbass. So I basically, when I went there, it wasn't to then say like I know all about this region's history. It was because I realized that this was an issue that had fallen out of the media. And so what I actually had hoped when I went there, I'd hoped not to become the person that knows everything about there, but to make contacts there that I could then transmit, their reporting. So that, and also to hear for myself, what was happening. But all that to say, when the Orange Revolution was happening. I guess, well, I would have been politically still asleep at that point if it was 2004 or 5, because I didn't really start to wake up until that time, and it was with the issue of Palestine. So I don't actually know really. I mean, I have to imagine it had Soros' involvement, but I don't really know beyond that.
Yeah. I was doing some, background reading. I mean, it's been a while since I'd, read anything or heard anything about it, but I went back to it, and it looked like it was sort of the prelude for what's going on now. I mean, we're talking, 10, 15 years, and with the ouster of the president, they both had similar names, and I can never keep them straight. They both had the first name of Victor. And a Ukrainian name that I can't keep track of. They both started with, the last name was started with V, so or Y. I mean, so their first name was Victor. Both names started with Y. Anyway, the president who, who was ousted before all this fighting that's taking place now that we're talking about. Resulted with him leaving Ukraine and going to Russia. And it was about him not wanting to join the EU in Ukraine. And this brought about what's happening now with the neo-Nazi regime that's in place. And these people who are considered Russian that are now fighting Ukraine. And again, thinking that even though they're Russian speakers, they think of themselves as Ukrainian, and it's their own country attacking them. That's just horrible.
Yeah, that's the part that's so strange about what's going on over there right now. What else did we want to talk about? You've blown us away with all of your information. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been incredible. Do you have anything else you want to bring up?
Did you have any other follow-up about Ukraine and some of the experiences? I mean, you're not far from there now. Are you going back at all, or?
I definitely want to go back. I did inquire, and I had the okay from the Donbass side, but I think because of COVID, it's still, I think travel, when I inquired, it was back in March, I think. So because of COVID, travel, it was only for citizens of the region that could travel there. But I'm going to keep trying to go back there because and I would recommend, there's a British photojournalist who has been there, Dean O'Brien, and he's quite active on Twitter, and he closely follows events there. So he's on a daily basis tweeting either from a news source or from his sources that he met on the ground there, tweeting about both about the Ukrainian violations of the ceasefire, the use of heavy weaponry, and also about how people living in these areas can't afford to live, just like people have been forced into poverty that they did not deserve or request in Gaza and in Syria. He just posts things about volunteers taking food or clothing or etc. to these people in frontline areas that some of them are injured, some of them are living alone, have no one else, So he's a great source of information on things Donbass that I would recommend people follow. But yeah, I do want to go back there when I can.
And he's on the ground, as you say, so you're getting.
Well, he's not on the ground now. He's been there, but he's also trying to go back. But he's got good sources on the ground, and I haven't seen him put out any information that I wouldn't think is verifiable, not verifiable, whatever.
Yeah. You mentioned in your article that one of the officials you spoke to has a Telegram account, both in Russian and in English now.
Yeah, that's the mayor of the city of Gorlevka. His last name is Pridko, I believe. And he was actually very, very helpful because, it was my first time there, and people might not be aware, but like as with Syria, when you go to the Donbass, you have to take hard cash with you because of the sanctions. You can't use ATMs. So you have to come with the amount of money you think you'll need to cover accommodation, transportation, etc. Mm-hmm. And so I did take a certain amount of money with me, but I didn't really understand like would I be able to hire a taxi, or could I use local transport? So he was actually super helpful in helping me organize things. I'm very grateful to him. He understood that my intent in going there was to try to bring more light to the suffering of the people there. So he was very helpful in giving me time to speak with me about the situation there, but also in helping me organize things. And then there was a remarkable woman, Irina, from a village called Zaitsevo, and she was like the head of administration of that village. And this is one of these villages that is right on the front line of being fired upon. And she's a very courageous woman. She was basically saying, like, their village hasn't seen peace since this all started. They haven't known ceasefire. And indeed, when I was going through the village and like the houses on the front line, most of them have been at least been shelled, if not been burned out by the shelling. So they can light a fire either by shelling or even by machine gun fire. Apparently, this is what I was told. If the machine gun fire, strikes whatever is able to strike a spark or whatever, and nobody's home to take care of the house, it can go up in flames. And when I was there, I saw a house that was still smoldering from, I think, a day or two prior, having been shelled. Anyway, this woman, Irina, she learned how to drive because she said there was nobody else going and covering and taking photos and videos and documenting what was happening. So she learned to drive. And then she started, as soon as she heard of some sort of shelling, driving there herself and documenting it. Very strong, courageous woman. And yeah, she just had a lot to say about, the horrors they've gone through. And she also, I asked her about the OSCE, and she said they've lodged countless complaints and been met, with relative silence. I mean, the OSCE will put out a statement, but not the kind of statement you would get from the UN if, say, Syria had actually used a chemical weapon against its people, right, which it didn't. The indignation that you get when it's the aggressor side, whether it's like the NATO countries or Israel, they get all the righteous indignation of the world and all the bodies that serve them. But then people who are being aggressed on a daily basis get nothing, even though they have documentation.
Yeah, and it seems that that's the commonality, or there's a lot of commonality between all the stories we've talked about today. That there's this unequal amount of coverage and weight being given to one side over the other, and credibility as well as the human rights violations and the international law violations that are being waged by the aggressor in every single case that we talk about, even especially Absolutely. Well, even in the case of what we opened with the the Native American mass grave.
Given your history and your all the places that you've been and everything that you've covered, do you see this turning around for anyone at all? I know it's going to have to be a people's revolution. I mean, I don't feel hopeful for.
I don't. Let's see. It depends. I think it depends if we're talking globally or a specific region. What I do feel hopeful for example, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, is during the last Israeli bombardment of Gaza, Palestinian resistance factions were all united, which is a pretty historic thing. Wow. Because they'd had their divisions in the past, but they were all united. And of course, I would refer people to the wonderful Lebanese journalist Marwa Osman. She's a fountain of information. She lives in Lebanon. She is very well informed. And I interviewed her, and she was making this point, like this was something historic. They were united. And they were actually, I mean, Israel certainly has the military might by far, but they were able to send a very strong message to Israel to make it stop bombing, essentially. I can send you the link to that interview with Marwa. But anyway, that's what does give hope, is that if the resistance are united, and the other thing that both she and Laith Marouf, who's another, he's a Palestinian Syrian living in Lebanon, a political commentator, and he was also making the point that while Israel was bombing Gaza, within all of historic Palestine, Palestinians were coming out and in the streets and protesting, which is difficult to do under occupation. So they were both pointing out the fact that, this was a new precedent wherein people were really standing up to the occupier. And then, of course, you have the support of Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran as well, and Syria. So it does give me some hope that potentially there could be, unfortunately, if it takes violence to get justice for Palestinians, so be it. It's their right under international law. And I using the word violence, I don't mean it in the way that Western media means it. I mean, right. Resistance doesn't involve violence, but it is their law, or their right under law to resist the occupier. So that gives me some hope. But as far as what's happening in the rest of the world,
yeah,
I mean, probably I would think that eventually there will be a resolution in the Donbass. But what's happening under COVID, I don't know. I don't see there being a people's movement. To be honest, I haven't been exposed to what you have, and our friends and colleagues elsewhere in the US, Canada, and European countries. I've been blissfully free of all this. My living in Syria, Serbia, and Russia, the most I've had to do sometimes is wear a mask in a store. On the metro, I don't wear a mask. Nobody stops me. In the stores here, people say wear a mask, you put it on your chin, that's fine. It's like, it's ridiculous. In fact, I was in a store the other day with a friend, and we were standing side by side, but he was paying. So I didn't have to wear a mask. And he had to put on this piece of cloth that had 2 slits in it, literally like a piece of, I don't know what kind of cloth, cotton, that had 2 slits on it. And that was the mask. And of course, it's like going like this. And that was enough. It was symbolic.
Right.
Yeah, it's
symbolic. Yeah.
But it's
yeah.
I don't really, I know I was saying to you yesterday, like, I don't really know what's going to happen here. I can't predict it. I'm not going to sit here stewing and thinking about it.
Right.
I want to feel optimistic that perhaps here things won't go south as it has in Ontario. I mean, if I was in Ontario where I was living prior to all this, I think I would be a complete mental case by now because they've got it like one of the hardest lockdowns and ridiculous restrictions in North America.
Yeah.
They do. Yeah, and we've been, our guest from last week, Guy Crittenden, moved to Latin America. He was in Toronto, or a suburb of Toronto, but he's native of Toronto, and he's like, I just can't imagine what it would be like for me right now. I wouldn't be able to do the kind of activism that I'm doing remotely in Ontario right now.
Yeah.
Well, it gives me hope then to hear you say that you've seen, the unity in these various regions. I feel like we're kind of all at war right now. Like war is being waged on us, all of us.
Yeah.
Of course, war to me versus war to someone in Gaza is.
They're two different things.
Completely different, of course. I'm not trying to compare,
But I think the intent is the same.
Yes, but the intent is the same. And I think that the key is unity. And, for you to say that you've seen some progress with these various different cultures who are setting aside their differences to fight the bigger issue, then that's, we should probably take a lesson from that. Here in the West, I think if people would just get over themselves, but yeah.
Well, that's what this platform's about. We attract we try to attract people from all tendencies politically, and we have our own, of course, but we try to ignore that in this presentation and bring people on who can speak to what we're trying to convey informationally, from a broader context, and certainly, you've brought a world of information to your readers and to the people on your channel as well. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Yes, thank you so much. We this is really out of our wheelhouse, so thank you for just informing us here as well as our audience. And we're going to continue to educate ourselves about what's going on in these different regions, so we know what we're talking about. And but we appreciate
Likewise,
Yeah.
I have a lot to. I have a big. My learning curve is still quite steep on many issues. So I think,
Yeah.
but I think, I mean, we all complement one each other in that regard, right? We all have our realms of somewhat expertise or knowledge, at least,
Right.
that we
Yeah,
share.
for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we're gonna wrap it up. Any last thoughts? Any place that you'd like to direct people?
I'll send you my Linktree link,
Okay.
which has links to the various platforms I'm on. I guess Telegram is a good one to direct people to, but it's probably easiest that I just send you that link and then you can share that.
All right. That's great. That's great.
Thank you so much. It's great to finally talk with you, and
Me too.
yeah, it's an honor. I really respect the work you guys are doing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I just think, like, you're talking about unity, and you're absolutely right. There has been so much division. Of course, not just starting last year, but it's really increased during the past year and a half.
Yeah.
So it's really great to talk with people who are putting up a good fight, and also, you know, for humanity, not for selfish, politically motivated reasons, but
Right.
for humanity.
Right.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Like the song says, it's all about humanity.
It's all about humanity. Right.
Okay.
We will be right back with you, so don't go away. But we're gonna
Wrap up the show.
Wrap up the show now.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you for
Thank you.
coming on to Pullquote.
Thank you.
All right. Well.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
I'm blown away. It's a lot of
I am too.
information.
Yeah. Well, you know, it was what I like about her writing is it's easy to comprehend. It comes across. I mean, you can absorb it pretty easily. I went through several articles, and despite the length, unlike other writers, I found that the length didn't matter. I was able to pick up a lot of information quickly. So that's something I appreciate about her writing.
And I appreciate the fact that she goes to the places that she writes about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so we want to thank you guys for joining today and making your comments and supporting our work. Please go to Patreon and become a patron. You can join Rockfin, and we will be back in about a week with Helen of Destroy.
Helen of Destroy. And we'll also be seeing you next week on a bookmark the day before Helen of Destroy.
Right. So, but thank you again for joining us today. We hope that you got something out of it. And that we hope that you do read Eva's work, and that you follow her on Twitter. We will put all that information in the show notes, including her Linktree.
Yeah.
So that you can educate yourself even more.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Cool. Well, we'll see you next time on another edition of
Pullquote.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Book of Hours are artists here to empower and embolden your response to the constant negative sound bites that attack your news and social media feeds. In order to continue making the video essays and art you've come to enjoy, we need your support. Make a one-time donation or become a patron. Thank you.